Welcome to this wild journey through one of the most messed up stories in all of American history. Before we get started, drop in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. We really want to know where and when people are sitting down to hear these crazy true stories. So the summer of 1844, and let me tell you, something really dark and creepy came crashing down on one of Charleston's most important and powerful families. Everything I'm about to tell you has been pieced together from old court records, church files, personal letters, newspaper clippings, and stories passed down that survived long enough for college researchers to finally write them all down back in the 1960s. What makes this story so extra scary isn't just the killing and the blood, though trust me, there was plenty of that. It's how slow and careful and patient the revenge was. Like this person took their sweet time. The Ruddle family's big fancy house sat about 3 miles north of Charleston, surrounded by huge old oak trees covered in Spanish moss that seemed to whisper secrets when the ocean wind blew through. The main house, with its tall columns and perfectly even wings, looked out over the Cooper River, where big merchant ships passed by on their way to the busy harbor. This is the house where Sarah Elizabeth Ruddle, the wife of a big-deal lawyer named William Harrison Ruddle, started feeling really sick, and what happened to her was anything but normal. But to really understand what went down during those hot, sweaty summer months, we gotta go back and look at what this household was like before people started dropping dead. The Ruddle plantation had been passed down through 4 generations of the same family, and they had made a ton of money growing rice, using the forced labor of over 70 enslaved people. William Harrison Ruddle had gotten the whole property from his dad when he was just 25, and he grew it even bigger through smart deals and his fancy connections with Charleston's rich and powerful crowd. Sarah Elizabeth Ruddle, who used to be Sarah Elizabeth Baker before she got married, came from an equally big-name Charleston family. Their wedding back in 1835 was one of the most over-the-top celebrations the city had seen in years, bringing together 2 of the oldest and most well-known families around. Together they had 3 kids, Thomas, who was 8, Catherine, who was 6, and little baby James, who had just been born in January of 1844. From the outside, the Ruddles looked like the perfect picture of wealthy Southern life. The house was mostly run by enslaved workers who kept everything looking perfect: the house, the grounds, and the people living there. There was Mary, a house servant who had been with the family since William was a little kid. There was Richard, who was in charge of the horses and was known all across the county for how good he was with them. There was Hannah, who looked after the children. And there was Martha, a young woman who had been bought from a nearby plantation about 2 years before to be Sarah's personal helper. But the most unusual person in the whole house was Rebecca. Rebecca had been born into slavery on the Ruddle plantation about 40 years earlier, and she worked as the family's midwife, basically the woman who helped babies get born safely. Her mom had been an enslaved woman from the Gila region who knew all about herbs and healing, and Rebecca had used that knowledge to help deliver babies for countless families, both on the plantation and at the homes of other rich families nearby. She was so skilled at what she did that William's dad had actually let her keep a small garden behind the kitchen house where she grew different medicinal plants. What most people didn't know, though, was that Rebecca had also delivered William himself about 35 years before, had been there for the births of all his brothers and sisters, and had brought all 3 of his own children into the world. In a society that was completely divided by race, Rebecca had this strange position of being both totally essential and totally invisible at the same time. She moved through the house quietly and efficiently, and the Ruddles barely even noticed she was there. That's the kind of world it was. Enslaved people were treated like furniture, present but unseen. So the whole nightmare starts pretty casually back in March of 1844, about 2 months after baby James was born. Sarah started complaining about being tired all the time, having headaches, and sometimes her stomach was bothering her. At first, everyone just figured it was normal stuff after having a baby, but as spring went on, she got worse and worse. By early May, she looked pale and had lost a noticeable amount of weight. The family doctor, a guy named Edward Thompson, had been treating the Ruddles for years, and he thought she might have malaria, which wasn't uncommon in the swampy lowlands around Charleston, so he gave her a tonic made of iron and quinine. It didn't help. Actually, if anything, Sarah started going downhill faster after she started taking it. She could barely eat anything, and what little food she could manage was just a few spoonfuls of soup. She got so weak that by June she couldn't even get out of bed without someone helping her. The strong, capable woman who used to run the whole house with total confidence had turned into a shadow of herself, stuck in bed with the curtains closed to block out the harsh summer sun. Dr. Thompson kept coming by more and more often. He tried leeches to drain what he thought might be bad blood. He gave her mercury, arsenic, and bismuth, all of which were standard treatments back in those days. Nothing worked. In fact, every new thing they tried seemed to make her worse. By early July, the entire household was running around like crazy trying to help Sarah, servants rushing in and out with fresh sheets, water, and whatever little bit of food she could get down. All through this whole mess, Rebecca stayed in the background, quietly making herbal teas she said would help with stomach pain or fever. She moved through the house without making a sound, watching everything while looking like she was watching nothing. If anyone had been paying closer attention, they might have noticed that Rebecca always seemed to show up whenever Dr. Thompson was talking to William about Sarah's condition, or when the kitchen staff was preparing Sarah's meals. But in a house where enslaved people were treated like they were part of the furniture, there but invisible, nobody said a word about Rebecca always hanging around. On the morning of July 23, 1844, Sarah Elizabeth Ruddle died in her bed at just 29 years old. The official cause of death was written down as wasting illness of unknown origin, which basically means nobody had any idea what actually killed her. 2 days later, her funeral was held at St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Charleston, and practically every important family in the city showed up. Sarah was buried in the Ruddle family plot at Magnolia Cemetery, her grave marked by a white marble angel that had been imported all the way from Italy. Life in the Ruddle house tried to go back to normal after the funeral. William buried himself in his law work, often not coming home until the kids were already in bed. Thomas and Catherine were mostly looked after by Hannah, their nurse, while baby James was taken care of by Martha, who used to be Sarah's personal helper. The house settled into that heavy, weird quiet that follows a tragedy, you know, the kind where the silence feels like it actually has weight to it. Then, about 3 weeks after the funeral, William himself started showing symptoms that sounded an awful lot like what had happened to his wife. First the headaches, then nausea, then getting weaker and weaker. He figured it was grief and overwork at first, but by the time August rolled around and he was still getting worse, Dr. Thompson was called back out to the Ruddle estate. The doctor's face gave it all away the moment he examined William. The similarity to Sarah's illness was too obvious to ignore. Again, they tried tonics, purgatives, bloodletting, and again, nothing helped. By early September, William was in the same bed where his wife had died just weeks before. His skin had turned yellowish, and he was having violent stomach cramps that left him drenched in sweat and barely conscious. Whispers started going around the household about some kind of contagion, like maybe the whole family was catching something, but Dr. Thompson didn't buy that explanation. Contagious diseases spread fast and wide. They don't just hit 2 people and leave everyone else totally fine. None of the kids or the house servants had gotten sick. Something else was going on here, something that was targeting specific people on purpose. And here's where things get really wild. It was Martha, the young woman who used to be Sarah's personal helper, who first said the thing that would end up blowing the whole mystery wide open. One evening in the middle of September, while William was getting worse and worse, she pulled Richard the stable master aside and whispered something that made his blood run cold. "I've seen Rebecca adding something to the master's tea," she said, looking over her shoulder to make sure nobody was listening. "A powder she keeps in a little cloth pouch tied around her waist. She does it when she thinks nobody's watching." Richard basically laughed it off at first. Rebecca had been with the Ruddle family for decades. She was a healer, not a poisoner. Obviously, she'd be making medicinal teas for someone who was sick, but Martha wasn't backing down. "It's the same tea she used to make for Mistress Sarah," she kept saying. "And I've seen her collecting leaves and roots from places way beyond her own little garden, plants I've never seen her grow before." Reluctantly, Richard agreed to watch Rebecca more carefully, mostly just to calm Martha down. But after 3 days of actually paying attention, he couldn't deny what Martha had been telling him. Rebecca really was adding some kind of unknown powder to William's tea, a grayish stuff that she carefully measured out from a pouch hidden under her apron. Not sure what to do next, Richard went to Mary, the oldest of the house servants and the one person whose judgment he trusted the most. Mary listened to the whole thing without interrupting, her face not giving anything away. When Richard finished talking, she went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "There are things about Rebecca you don't know. Things that happened before you came to this plantation." What Mary told him that night would later be written up in an official statement given to Charleston authorities, though the document itself would be locked away by court order until 1869. According to Mary, Rebecca had given birth to a daughter about 20 years earlier. The baby's father was William Harrison Ruddle Sr., the current master's own dad. The baby girl was born with fair skin and green eyes that made it absolutely clear whose daughter she was, and she had been sold off to a plantation in Georgia when she was just 3 years old, even though Rebecca begged and pleaded to keep her. Rebecca was never the same after that, Mary explained. She kept doing her job as midwife. She delivered the current master himself and all his brothers and sisters. She smiled and served and kept her head down, but something in her eyes changed. Something died inside her. But the reason Rebecca seemed to be going after Sarah specifically, that part was still unclear, until Mary shared the final piece of the puzzle. Not long after William and Sarah got married in 1835, a letter had arrived at the Ruddle house addressed to William Harrison Ruddle Sr. The letter contained news that Rebecca's daughter had died under mysterious and suspicious circumstances. The girl, now a young woman of 16, had been working as a house servant in the home of a wealthy family related to the Bakers, which was Sarah's family. "I believe Rebecca has been waiting all these years," Mary said, "waiting for the perfect moment to get her revenge on both families, the Ruddles who took her child, and the Bakers who she blamed for her daughter's death. And what better revenge than to destroy their bloodlines just like they destroyed hers?" Richard and Mary's suspicions were confirmed the very next day when they secretly watched Rebecca adding that mysterious powder not just to William's tea, but also to the milk being prepared for baby James. Horrified, they grabbed the poisoned drinks and replaced them with clean ones before anyone could get to them. That night, while Rebecca was busy helping Dr. Thompson check on William, they snuck into her quarters and searched the place. Hidden under the floorboards of her little cabin, they found a collection of small cloth pouches filled with powders and dried plant material. They also found a journal, written in a mix of English and Gullah, that carefully recorded the symptoms of arsenic poisoning and tracked, with cold precision, the declining health of both Sarah and William. And most damning of all, a lock of light brown hair tied with blue ribbon hair that could only have come from Rebecca's daughter. The evidence went straight to Dr. Thompson, who examined the powders and confirmed there was arsenic in them, plus several other toxic substances made from plants that didn't even grow naturally around Charleston. With all of this evidence in hand, authorities showed up at the Ruddle plantation on the morning of September 20, 1844. Rebecca was arrested without a fight. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look sorry. Her face showed absolutely nothing. The trial that followed became one of the most jaw-dropping legal cases in the whole history of Charleston before the Civil War. It was held in October of 1844 and drew spectators from all over the region. Rebecca wasn't allowed to have a lawyer, as was totally normal for enslaved people accused of crimes against white people back then, and she stood in complete silence as witness after witness described the evidence against her. Dr. Thompson testified that William was slowly recovering now that the source of the poisoning had been removed. Martha and Richard described what they'd seen. Mary revealed the painful backstory that had presumably driven Rebecca to do what she did. When the judge asked if Rebecca wanted to say anything in her own defense, she finally broke her silence for the first and only time during the whole trial. Her words were recorded by the court clerk and preserved in the trial transcript. "I brought them into this world. It was fitting that I should usher them out. What was taken from me cannot be restored. What I have taken cannot be undone. There is a balance in all things." The jury took less than an hour to come back with a guilty verdict. On November 2, 1844, Rebecca was hanged in the yard of the Charleston workhouse, making her the first and only enslaved woman convicted of poisoning to be publicly executed in the city. According to newspaper accounts from the time, she stayed calm and collected until the very end, facing her death with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout her whole life. After the trial, William Harrison Ruddle made a real recovery, though he was never fully back to his old strong self. He lived another 11 years before dying of pneumonia in 1855 at the age of 46. All three of his children grew up to be adults. Thomas eventually inherited the plantation but sold it in 1871 and moved to Baltimore. Catherine married a northern businessman and moved to Philadelphia after the Civil War. And little James, the baby who had nearly been poisoned, grew up to become a doctor. Maybe all those years of living in the shadow of poison had something to do with that choice. The Ruddled plantation itself was eventually broken up and sold off in pieces after the hard times that followed the Civil War. The main house stood until 1894, when it was destroyed in a fire of unknown cause. When archaeologists dug around the site in 1965, they found the foundations of the house and several smaller buildings, including what was believed to be Rebecca's cabin. Among the things they found was a small blue glass bottle containing traces of arsenic mixed with several plant toxins. What makes this case so haunting isn't just how calculated Rebecca's revenge was, it's the whole rotten system of power and abuse that made it possible in the first place. Rebecca, separated from her child with absolutely no legal way to fight back against what had been done to her, found her power in the only place left open to her: the knowledge of plants and medicines that had been passed down through generations of women. The Ruddled poisoning case faded from public memory as the Civil War and everything that came after it completely changed the South. It briefly came back into the spotlight in 1962 when a historian named Margaret Johnston found the sealed court records while doing research for a book about Charleston before the Civil War. Her notes, which she deposited in the University of South Carolina archives, were later lost during a building renovation in 1968. The actual documents were reportedly destroyed in a courthouse fire the following year. All that's left now are pieces: a few newspaper stories, entries in old church death records, passing mentions in personal letters from back then, and oral histories collected by Johnston before her notes were lost. From these scattered crumbs, people have tried to piece together this dark chapter in Charleston's history. A chapter that shows just how complicated and terrible the relationship between enslaved people and their enslavers really was. Between those who had power and those who found ways to fight back against it. Today, the land where the Ruddled plantation used to stand has been completely reclaimed by forest and thick underbrush. No sign or marker shows where the main house stood or where Rebecca had her little cabin. The graves of Sarah Elizabeth and William Harrison Ruddled can still be found in Magnolia Cemetery, the headstones worn but still readable. Rebecca's burial place, like those of most enslaved people, remains unmarked and unknown. But according to local legend, and this is where we get into real ghost story territory. On certain nights when there's no moon and the Spanish moss hangs extra still in the humid air, people who visit the area have reported smelling herbs on the breeze: rosemary, thyme, and something sharper, more metallic. Some say they've heard the soft sound of leaves being ground up and the quiet murmuring of a woman's voice saying something in a language nobody speaks anymore. And in the oldest families of Charleston, there's this unspoken fear of certain teas, certain mixtures, certain combinations of herbs that might, in the wrong hands, become tools of a justice that was denied for way too long. In the years after Rebecca's execution, several other cases of suspected poisoning by enslaved people were reported across the Carolinas, though none were prosecuted as aggressively or documented as thoroughly as the Ruddled case. Maybe the most telling detail of all is an addition to South Carolina law passed in 1846, specifically banning enslaved people from growing or owning certain plants known to have medical or poisonous properties. The story of Rebecca and the Ruddled family is a chilling reminder that revenge, when every other option has been completely shut off, can find its way through the most intimate parts of daily life: making food and drink, taking care of the sick, helping bring new life into the world. It reminds us that power, no matter how total it seems, is never truly complete, and that people who are seen as powerless often find and create their own terrible weapons. As for Martha, the woman whose sharp eyes led to Rebecca's arrest, records show that she was sold to a plantation in Alabama in 1845. Nobody knows what happened to her after that. Richard stayed at the Ruddled plantation until he was freed after the Civil War, then started a small horse stable in Charleston. Mary also lived to see freedom, dying in 1872 at an estimated age of 85. In her final years, she reportedly refused to talk about Rebecca or anything that had happened back in 1844. If anyone brought it up, she'd just turn away and say nothing. Maybe the most haunting question this whole story leaves us with is this: in a system built on deep and total injustice, where can real justice ever actually be found? Rebecca's actions, as horrifying as they were, grew out of a lifetime of suffering that most of us today can't even begin to fully imagine. The legal execution that ended her life was carried out to protect the exact same system that had destroyed her family in the first place. There are no heroes in this story, only victims at different levels, all caught up in the grinding, crushing machine of slavery, a machine that twisted and poisoned everything it touched. The so-called poisoned bloodline of the Ruttleds and Bakers didn't end with William's recovery. According to letters found from the 1880s, people in both families kept suffering from mysterious illnesses, often with symptoms that looked just like what Sarah and William had gone through. Medical knowledge back then wasn't good enough to figure out whether these later cases were from earlier poisoning still working through their bodies, some kind of genetic issue, or just the powerful effect of suggestion in families haunted by their own dark history. What we do know is that by 1900, both the Ruttled and Baker family lines had shrunk dramatically, lots of branches ending in childlessness or early death. Whether that was the final payoff of Rebecca's curse, or just the natural end of family lines over time, is impossible to say for certain. But in the whispered stories passed down through generations of Charleston's oldest families, the name Rebecca still carries a weight of dread, a cautionary tale of revenge that seems to reach beyond death itself to collect what it's owed. The land where the Ruttled plantation stood remains strangely resistant to being developed. Multiple attempts throughout the 1900s to build on the property were all abandoned after running into unexplained problems, equipment breaking down, workers getting sick, money running out. Local superstition says the ground itself has been tainted, not by arsenic or herbs, but by the weight of history and unresolved injustice. In 1969, during the last archaeological survey of the site before it was swallowed up by wilderness, researchers found something completely unexpected beneath the remains of Rebecca's cabin. As they dug, they uncovered a small bundle wrapped in faded blue cloth containing the skeletal remains of an infant. Forensic analysis suggested the child had died at or shortly after birth. No record exists of Rebecca having a second child, and the age of the remains pointed to a burial sometime around 1824 or 1825, years before everything else unfolded. Was this another heartbreak that fed Rebecca's decades-long thirst for revenge, another child lost, this time to nature rather than to human cruelty? The records don't say. The remains were reburied without any ceremony at the insistence of local community leaders. And so the story of the enslaved midwife who poisoned her mistress's bloodline slips into the space between history and folklore, a dark thread woven into the complicated fabric of America's past. It reminds us that underneath the pretty, romanticized picture of the Old South that you see in books and movies, there's a much more complicated and disturbing reality. A reality where power and resistance, love and hate, life and death were all tangled up together in ways that continue to haunt us even today. If you ever find yourself in Charleston, walking the old streets or visiting the ancient cemeteries where generations of the city's elite are buried in fancy tombs, listen carefully to the stories the tour guides tell. You might hear a cleaned-up version of Rebecca's story, usually framed as a scary warning about the dangers the plantation aristocracy faced. What you're much less likely to hear is the fuller truth that Rebecca's actions, however terrible, were one woman's desperate attempt to tip the scales back in her direction in a world that had deliberately stacked everything against her. In the end, maybe the most fitting memorial to Rebecca and everyone touched by this tragedy isn't a statue or a sign on the side of the road. It's the uneasy silence that still hangs over certain parts of our shared history. A silence that, when finally broken, reveals stories we are still struggling to fully hear and understand. Like poison slowly working its way through a bloodline, the effects of our history keep showing up in ways both obvious and hidden, challenging us to confront the messy, complicated legacy of those who came before us and the systems they built and resisted. As the sun sets over the marshes and rivers surrounding Charleston, as the ancient oak trees stretch their long shadows across land that has both changed and stayed the same over time, the story of Rebecca and the Ruttleds whispers on, a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most orderly society, there are currents of rage and resistance, love and loss that can burst through when you least expect them, changing forever the course of individual lives and the bigger story we all share. The final records about the Ruttled case were reportedly sealed in the state archives in Columbia, South Carolina in 1971, considered too sensitive or potentially explosive for the public to see. Whether those records still exist or have been lost to time like so many other documents from that era, nobody knows for sure. But in the absence of official histories, the story keeps getting passed down through generations, changing a little with each telling but holding on to its core truth, that in a world where justice is denied, revenge can become a terrible substitute, one that echoes across decades and centuries, demanding to be paid. And so we leave Rebecca and the Ruttleds to their uneasy rest, their story neither fully told nor completely forgotten. A shadow narrative running just beneath the more comfortable histories we prefer to remember, whispering to us about debts that haven't been paid and accounts still being tallied in the ledger books of time. In 2004, during renovations on an old building in downtown Charleston that used to house the law firm where William Harrison Ruttled had worked, construction workers stumbled onto a hidden compartment inside a wall. Inside was a small wooden box with what looked like personal items, a tarnished silver locket, a folded piece of yellowed paper, and a small vial of dark liquid. The building's owner, recognizing that the items might be historically important, donated them to the Charleston Museum. Analysis of everything inside revealed something stunning. The locket contained a lock of hair, 2 strands twisted together, one dark, one light brown. DNA testing, limited by how old the samples were, suggested the 2 people were close relatives. The folded paper, carefully preserved, turned out to be a bill of sale for a mulatto female child, aged 3 years, sound in body and mind. The child's name was listed as Sarah. The buyer was a representative of the Baker family in Georgia, relatives of the woman who would later become Sarah Elizabeth Ruttled. The seller was identified as William Harrison Ruttled Sr., and the vial. When forensic chemists analyzed it, they found traces of a complex mixture of arsenic, belladonna, and several plant compounds known to cause symptoms just like the ones Sarah Elizabeth and William Ruttled had experienced in 1844. Residue analysis suggested the mixture was at least 150 years old. These discoveries sparked a whole new wave of interest in the Ruttled poisoning case among historians and archaeologists. In 2007, a team from the University of South Carolina got permission to use ground-penetrating radar to scan the old Ruttled plantation site. What they found beneath all the overgrown plants wasn't just the foundations of the main house and outbuildings that earlier digs had already documented. They also found evidence of a previously unknown structure located about 50 yards from Rebecca's cabin. Careful digging revealed the remains of what looked like a small dwelling, even more basic than the other slave quarters on the property. Carbon dating of items found there suggested it had been occupied sometime between 1820 and 1825, the period when, based on the limited historical record, Rebecca would have been pregnant and given birth to her daughter. Most significant of everything they found was a small clay pot buried under the packed dirt floor. Inside the pot were a few items: a child's tooth wrapped in cloth, 3 glass beads made in Europe, and a small wooden doll with features carved in a style consistent with West African traditions. Anthropologists familiar with Gullah Geechee cultural practices identified these items as consistent with protective charms often made for children. These discoveries gave a more layered and human understanding of Rebecca's life before the events that led to her execution. They suggested that she really had given birth to a child fathered by William Harrison Ruttled Sr., that she had tried to protect this child through both practical and spiritual means, and that despite all her efforts, the child had been sold to relatives of the Baker family at age 3. More digging in previously unexplored archives also turned up a series of letters exchanged between members of the Baker family in Georgia and their relatives in Charleston during 1840 to 1843. These letters, part of a private collection donated to the Georgia Historical Society, contained references to a troublesome mulatto servant girl who had been punished repeatedly for not following orders. One letter from November 1842 mentioned that the girl had been put in her place after trying to run away, and that measures had been taken to ensure she would cause no further difficulty. The final letter in the series, from January 1843, noted simply that the problem had been permanently resolved and that the writer was looking for a replacement house servant. No further mention of the girl appeared after that. This timing lines up exactly with Mary's testimony that news of Rebecca's daughter's death under suspicious circumstances had reached Charleston shortly before William and Sarah's wedding in 1835. These discoveries paint a much more complete picture of what may have driven Rebecca to do what she did. Her daughter taken from her as a toddler and sold to relatives of the woman who would later marry into the Ruthold family, had apparently died under circumstances that suggested abuse or even murder. Rebecca, with no power to protect her child or seek justice through any official means, had patiently waited for years, carefully growing her knowledge of herbs and poisons, positioning herself as the trusted midwife who would deliver the children of the very families responsible for her unimaginable loss. The cold, calculated nature of her revenge becomes even more chilling when you realize that she waited until after Sarah had given birth to her third child before she started the poisoning. Rebecca made sure the bloodlines continued just long enough to create maximum suffering, parents living long enough to become attached to their children, to love them, and then to watch them wither and die in agony. It wasn't just death she wanted to deliver. It was the same long, drawn-out grief that she herself had been forced to endure. In 2011, an unexpected source added even more to the story. A descendant of Mary, the house servant whose testimony had been so important in Rebecca's conviction, came forward with a family document that had been carefully kept through the generations. The document, written in 1872 shortly before Mary's death, contained her full account of what had happened in 1844, including details she had never shared during her official testimony. According to this account, Mary had known about what Rebecca was doing for a while before she said anything to the authorities. She had watched Rebecca collecting plants from the marshes and forests around the plantation, noticed the careful way she prepared certain teas and tonics, and recognized the gradual decline of Sarah's health as something that was definitely not natural illness. Yet she had stayed silent, trapped in an impossible situation, loyalty to the Ruthold family who owned her, loyalty to Rebecca who had been her close friend and confidant for decades, and her own conscience telling her something was very wrong. What finally made Mary act, according to her written account, wasn't concern for William's life, it was fear for the children, especially little baby James. "I could not stand by and watch a babe suffer for the sins of its father and grandfather," she wrote. "Rebecca's vengeance had justice in it, but the children were innocent and I could not bear their deaths on my conscience." Mary's account also revealed that Rebecca had actually confided in her about the full extent of her plan, not just to kill Sarah and William, but to systematically poison every member of both the Ruthold and Baker families that she could reach. She had apparently been in contact with other enslaved people living in households connected to both families and had shared her poison knowledge with them. Her plan was to erase both bloodlines from the earth, Mary wrote, as they had tried to erase her daughter. Whether Rebecca actually succeeded in this bigger plan is hard to know for certain. Historical records do show that in the decades after her execution, both the Ruthold and Baker families experienced unusually high rates of unexplained illness, infertility, and early death. By 1900, as already mentioned, both family lines had shrunk dramatically. Was that the result of Rebecca's poison reaching across generations? Or just the outcome of the Civil War, economic changes, and the natural scattering of families over time? The historical record can't give us a definitive answer. What is clear, though, is that Rebecca's story is about so much more than just murder or revenge. It captures the complicated moral universe of American slavery, a world where normal ideas about justice, loyalty, and right and wrong were twisted so far out of shape that they were almost unrecognizable. In a system where human beings were legally property, where families could be torn apart on a slaveholder's whim, where sexual abuse was routine and totally accepted, the normal moral rulebook simply couldn't contain the depths of what people experienced and how they responded. In 2015, the Charleston City Council debated a proposal to include Rebecca's story in the city's official historical tour. After heated arguments, the proposal was rejected on the grounds that it might make the city's history look bad and focus on division rather than healing. That decision itself becomes part of the continuing story, yet another example of how certain histories keep getting pushed to the side or silenced in favor of more comfortable narratives. Yet despite official reluctance, Rebecca's story has kept circulating through other channels. Local tour guides who specialize in the darker parts of Charleston's history include versions of it in their nighttime tour. Community theater groups have put on dramatic performances based on it. Writers and artists have been inspired by this tale of power, resistance, and revenge. The story simply refuses to go away, maybe because it speaks to something deep and essential about America's troubled relationship with its own past. In 2019, during an unusually severe hurricane that slammed the South Carolina coast, flooding uncovered something that had been buried for generations. As the floodwaters receded, local residents noticed strange formations in the soil of an area that had been underwater. The outlines of what appeared to be a garden, perfectly preserved beneath layers of sediment. Botanical archaeologists from Clemson University excavated the site and identified the remains of numerous medicinal and poisonous plants, many of which weren't native to the region but would have been known to someone with knowledge of African herbal traditions. The garden's location matched exactly with historical descriptions of Rebecca's medicinal garden, the one that William's father had allowed her to keep decades earlier. Analysis of soil samples showed that certain toxic plants had been continuously cultivated there for at least 20 years before 1844, suggesting that Rebecca's plan had been in development way longer than anyone had ever suspected. But maybe the creepiest discovery of all was a small stone marker buried right at the center of the garden. Carved into its surface was a simple symbol, a circle with a line drawn through it, identified by cultural anthropologists as a symbol associated with certain West African traditions related to justice and the settling of debts. The stone was determined to have been placed there sometime around 1825, the year Rebecca's daughter was sold away from the plantation. These discoveries suggest that Rebecca's revenge wasn't some sudden decision made out of desperation or passion. It was a meticulously planned operation that had been developed and refined over decades. She had cultivated both her plants and her patience, waiting for exactly the right moment to deliver a revenge that would mirror the suffering she had endured, the slow, agonizing loss of family, the helplessness of watching the people you love suffer with absolutely no power to do anything about it. Medical researchers who looked at the case through the lens of modern toxicology have noted that the combination of substances Rebecca apparently used, arsenic, belladonna, and certain plant toxins, would have created symptoms that looked exactly like common illnesses in the region. The slow, gradual administration of these poisons would have caused them to build up in the victims' bodies over time, leading to more and more severe symptoms that would have completely baffled doctors of that era. The precision with which these poisons were given out suggests not just knowledge of their effects, but careful, calculated management of dosages, knowledge that Rebecca may have refined through observation and careful experimentation over many years. The question that haunts this whole story, and that keeps coming up for people hearing it today, isn't whether Rebecca's actions were right or wrong by regular moral standards. Most people would agree that poisoning others, including people who hadn't directly harmed her, is hard to justify. The real question is, what could justice possibly even mean in a situation where every normal avenue for getting justice had been deliberately and totally blocked off? In a legal system designed first and foremost to protect slaveholders' property rights, in a society that flat out refused to recognize enslaved people as human beings, in a world where a mother could have her child ripped away from her and sold like livestock, what form could justice possibly take? Rebecca's terrible answer to that question keeps disturbing us, precisely because it forces us to confront the complete moral collapse of the system that produced it. In 2022, a descendant of the Ruddled family, now living in Massachusetts, came forward with more family documents that had been carefully preserved over the generations. Among them was a journal kept by Catherine Ruddled, the middle child, who had been just 6 years old when her mother died. The journal, started when Catherine was a young woman and kept going throughout her whole life, contained her memories and reflections on what she had been told about the events of 1844. Catherine's account adds yet another layer to this already complex story. She remembered Rebecca as a constant, comforting presence in her early childhood, the woman who had helped bring her into the world, who had nursed her through childhood illnesses, who had taught her about the plants in the garden. She described the confusion and sense of betrayal she felt when she learned that this same woman had poisoned her mother and tried to kill her father and baby brother. But as Catherine got older and learned more about the full context of what had happened, her perspective shifted. Later entries in the journal show that she had discovered the truth about Rebecca's daughter and the role her own mother's relatives had played in the girl's death. She wrote about struggling to hold grief for her mother alongside a growing understanding of Rebecca's own loss and rage. In one especially heartbreaking entry from 1871, Catherine wrote, "I find myself in the impossible position of mourning both my mother and the woman who took her from me. For I cannot help but wonder, had our positions been reversed, what I might have done had my own child been torn from my arms and later destroyed by the very people who claimed the right to own her." There is no resolution to this terrible equation, she continued. No balancing of these scales. Catherine's journal reveals that her decision to move north after the Civil War was partly motivated by her desire to get away from the legacy of slavery and the impossible moral knots it had created in her life. She never had children of her own, a choice she explicitly connected to her fear that the poison in our bloodlines runs deeper than any substance Rebecca might have administered. It is the poison of a system that corrupted everything it touched. Thomas Ruddle, the oldest child, took a different path. After selling the plantation in 1871, he stayed in touch with several formerly enslaved people who had worked on the property, including Richard the stable master. In letters preserved in the Maryland Historical Society archives, Thomas expressed his belief that his father had known all along about Rebecca's daughter and had chosen to stay quiet about what his own father had done. "There was a reckoning that was perhaps long overdue," he wrote in one letter, "though I cannot help but wish it had taken some other form." James Ruddle, the infant who had nearly become Rebecca's third victim, did indeed grow up to become a doctor, as mentioned before. His medical journals, discovered in 2008 in the archives of Johns Hopkins University, where he eventually worked, reveal a deep preoccupation with poisons and their antidotes. He specialized in toxicology and published several papers on detecting and treating arsenic poisoning. Whether that career choice was his way of trying to understand the events that nearly killed him as a baby, or just a coincidence, is impossible to say. The story of Rebecca and the Ruddles has no neat ending, no clean moral lesson you can pull out and put in your pocket. It remains, like so much of American history, a story full of complexity and contradiction, of individual choices made inside systems that warped and twisted those choices beyond recognition. It reminds us that the legacy of slavery can't be reduced to simple stories of good guys and bad guys, but has to be understood as a moral catastrophe that corrupted everything inside its reach, those who kept it going, those who benefited from it, and those who fought back against it. In the marshlands surrounding Charleston, where the ruins of old plantations slowly sink back into the earth and the ghosts of the past seem to hover just out of sight, Rebecca's story keeps resonating. Local folklore says that on certain nights, especially when the moon is dark and the air is heavy with the smell of coming rain, a woman can be seen moving quietly through the trees, gathering plants and murmuring words in a language very few people remember anymore. Some claim to have smelled the distinctive scent of certain herbs boiling, even in places where no human being has lived for miles. These are just stories, of course, the ways communities process and carry difficult histories, the ways the past keeps its grip on the present. But they speak to the power of Rebecca's story and why it still feels relevant to what's happening in the world today, questions about justice, power, and the long shadow cast by America's original sin. The most recent chapter in this ongoing story came in 2023, when archaeological work at the site of the old Charleston workhouse, where Rebecca was executed, uncovered a mass grave holding the remains of numerous people who had died while imprisoned there or had been executed on the grounds. Forensic analysis found the partial remains of a woman who appeared to be between 50 and 60 years old, with signs of arthritis in her hands consistent with decades of detailed work like midwifery and herbalism. Though a definitive identification was impossible given the condition of the remains and how much time had passed, the location and details matched up with what we know about Rebecca. After consultations with community leaders and historians, these remains, along with everyone else recovered from the site, were reburied in a formal ceremony that acknowledged the complex history of the place and the lives that had ended there. The memorial service was attended by descendants of both formerly enslaved people and slaveholders from the region, and it represented a small but meaningful step toward the kind of reckoning with history that Rebecca's story demands. As we wrap up this account, we're left with questions rather than answers. What does justice look like in the wake of historical atrocities? How do you balance the need to truly understand the full complexity of the past with the desire for stories that allow for healing and moving forward? What debts haven't been paid? What accounts are still open in the ledger books of history? Rebecca's voice comes down to us only in fragments, filtered through the accounts of the people who condemned her and the systems built to silence her. But the power of her story doesn't fade. It forces us to face uncomfortable truths about American history and who we are as a country. In her final words before the court, "I brought them into this world. It was fitting that I should usher them out. What was taken from me cannot be restored. What I have taken cannot be undone." There is a balance in all things. We hear not just the voice of one woman driven to horrifying acts by unbearable loss. We hear an indictment of an entire society that built the conditions for such a tragedy. The poisoned bloodline at the center of this story reaches far beyond the biological descendants of the Ruddled and Baker families. It stretches into our present, into the persistent inequalities and unresolved wounds that continue to shape American society. Rebecca's story asks us to consider what poisons might still be working their way through our collective body, what antidotes might still be out there to be found, and what true healing might actually require. As night falls over Charleston, as the ancient oak trees cast their shadows over landscapes that have both changed and stayed the same over time, Rebecca's presence lingers, not as a simple villain or a simple victim, but as a complicated human being caught up in and responding to completely inhuman circumstances. Her story whispers to us still, demanding to be heard in all its complexity, refusing the comfort of easy judgment or convenient forgetting. In the end, maybe the most fitting memorial to Rebecca and all those swept up in the tragedy around her isn't a monument or a marker, it's the ongoing work of facing our shared past with courage and honesty. Because only by truly acknowledging the full weight of history, its complexity, its contradictions, its unpaid debts, can we even begin to imagine a future where the poisoned bloodlines of our national origins might finally, truly begin to heal.